there nevertheless always is some sort of natural continuity involved. In other words, the quantum world is not somehow mysteriously completely different from the natural world. There are interesting differences that kind of confound us a bit, but there are continuities. In other words, quantum mechanical principles are capable of explaining the structure and behavior of atoms, which in turn are responsible for how electrons share valence shells, and that explains in turn how molecules are possible by binding atoms together. So even though the quantum world in isolation is weird and kind of behaves not as we would expect normal objects to behave, nevertheless there are physical continuities. So you could see how explanations in one world affect explanations in another world. Theology doesn't do this. Theology just erects more mysteries and expects you to bow down and just sort of accept the mystery of how two completely different things with no continuity between them at all could somehow be responsible for each other.
And also in terms of how scientific explanations can sometimes seem quite mystical or have a theological taint to them. To a certain extent, the concepts that we're having to deal with, both in terms of theism or a naturalistic explanation, which could be quantum mechanics, that basically particles come in and out of existence and produce infinite amount of big bangs, is you're really basically dealing with concepts of what it is for something to be infinite, which is another kind of mind-boggling idea for human cognition to get around, and obviously the issue of eternity. But obviously there is sometimes a bit of academic struggle between philosophers, particularly philosophers of science, and say theoretical physicists, that we haven't even got time to cover. But in terms of explanatory power, then you've just highlighted why science fares better with the principle of sufficient reason, and it shows natural continuity. At the same time, in terms of explanations for the natural world, the naturalistic scientific method also has to have certain cautions behind it. But in terms of explanatory power, would you like to hedge a bet on which one has more explanatory power? Would you just say it is?
Well, because supernatural theology has, by definition, zero explanatory power, since it continually violates the principle of sufficient reason. Science, by default, to the extent it can find empirical warrant for its theories, always at least does a little bit better. Also, precisely because science is in the business of finding continuities between parts of nature, even with whatever caused the Big Bang and our natural universe, science isn't going to be in the business of finding something so unnatural that it is worthy of our obedience and worship, as mysterious and odd the laws of quantum mechanics may be that are responsible for the creation of universes. It's not the sort of thing where we're going to say, aha, now I know where the Ten Commandments came from. No. We're in the Einsteinian Spinoza realm, where we can be immensely thankful that our universe was created, but there's no one to whom to address the thanks. You can admit that there was a creation of the universe without knowing which temple to go to praise this mighty act. So because, right, science is in the business of finding natural continuities, we're just finding more, admittedly weirder, but more nature, right? There isn't a God. I mean, you can put a smiley face on it, but that, you're just erecting false idols at that point.
To summarize and condense your points in terms of natural continuity, so we have a question such as, why is there something rather than nothing? A theist defense of this position may be that we have a naturalistic system that has to be explained by a supernatural entity, which already fails in sufficient reason because supernatural and naturalism aren't by definition cohabiting. But at the same time, if we're going to take a naturalistic approach to why there's something rather than nothing, even though the paradigm of fluctuations in quantum mechanics, even though it deals with problematic issues of infinity and eternity, it still, to a certain extent, displays natural continuity. There is some kind of continuity from the micro level of how particles fluctuate and come into existence, and how this can then obviously produce universes, or a universe that we see. So that would be the fundamental illustration of how science, even though it has its own problems in terms of causal explanation, still presents a natural continuity rather than it's a supernatural entity outside this whole system in the first place.
Yeah, I think you've got it. I mean, in short, scientific naturalism enjoys two rational advantages over supernaturalist theology. First of all, supernaturalist theology doesn't even offer explanations that challenge or rival. Scientific naturalism can always postulate more nature in continuity with the nature that we already know. Second, supernaturalism can never prove that there isn't just more wilder nature out there that human learning is discovering. In other words, supernaturalism would have to prove that at some point nature must stop and the supernatural realm must begin. It is incapable of proving that. So scientific naturalism has every right to continue to postulate more nature behind the nature that we can observe. For example, whatever cause was responsible for the Big Bang, we're perfectly within our rational rights to postulate that it was more nature. And science has always done this. What is responsible for the creation of the planet Earth? Well, more nature in the form of a coalescing solar system with a star at the center of it. Well, what's responsible for stars? Well, more nature, right? Clouds of the original atoms produced out of the Big Bang condensed by gravity. And some of those clouds were dense and thick enough to supply enough mass for thermonuclear reaction to produce stars. Well, right, on and on and on. Where to galaxy? Well, it's more and more and more nature. So long as you're producing sufficient evidence to warrant these theories, we're following the spirit and the law of the principle of sufficient reason.
I just want to get, because obviously this is going to tie into your principle of sufficient reason and natural continuity, but to a certain extent we can assume that the naturalistic method, it's particularly in science, which is we always postulate more natural phenomena behind the natural phenomena that we see. For this very reason, when we tag along supernatural explanations at the end of it, as you say, where does one stop and where does one start? Now, in terms of sufficiency of an explanation, what does the fact that, for example, it's something like Occam's razor, what does something that the fact that we don't need God or a supernatural phenomena, even though, as you're saying, it doesn't actually make logical sense in this respect, because we don't need that to explain the existence of the natural world we see around us, what does that say about supernaturalism and the existence of God?
Interesting logical question, Occam's razor. But we have to know exactly where to cut with Occam's razor. So I think where Occam's razor is designed to cut is to demarcate between unnecessary explanations and useful warranted explanations. I don't think Occam's razor should be used to cut non-explanations apart from explanations. Here's what I mean. Suppose you have two scientific explanations, but one is going to violate the spirit of Occam's razor, right, by postulating additional unnecessary epicycles of, too much explanation. On the other hand, you have another scientific explanation which explains all the same evidence with, greater simplicity. Occam's razor suggests, go explore the simpler theory as far as you can. Now, it may turn out that simple theories are inadequate, so frequently we need more complicated explanations. So Occam's razor isn't the only tool in the scientific toolbox. But nevertheless, it's designed to cut between kinds of explanations. But if I'm right that supernatural explanations are in fact pseudo-explanations, they're not even explanations, I don't need Occam's razor, right? Occam's razor only applies to things that minimally qualify as explanations according to the principle of sufficient reason. If I were a very vain person, I would call it Shook's razor, that I'm applying before Occam's razor, but in fact I deserve no such priority because, of course, actually medieval scholastics, nominalists, for example, were very interested in what counts as genuine explanation. So a colleague of Occam might properly deserve the label of razor, and medievalists would sharply correct me for my presumption of a priority. But at any rate, we can call it Shook's razor now. So Shook's razor comes before Occam's razor in dealing with excessive theological speculation.
So essentially, because supernatural explanation doesn't even qualify to be an explanation in this sense, that Occam's razor doesn't even come into the equation. We've talked about the naturalistic scientific method, which deals with causation explanation. That's one area. Now, changing track still, but dealing with certain scientific investigations and the social sciences in general. What do you think some of the richest insights are from the social sciences in terms of religious belief and why people or societies have theistic beliefs? Now, of course, there's classic anthropological arguments here that obviously they're forms of binding what would have been ancient tribal communities together with a collective ethos larger than themselves. What's become very popular in the last decade or so is the need for the psychological cognitive disposition to hunt out agency even when agency is not there, and that's another big one in that field of work. And obviously more and more research from the neurosciences is suggesting that brain patterns that are used in everyday social learning and cognition are also the same patterns that are involved in postulating God, which at this context becomes just another unseen agent, which is basically a byproduct of our abstract imagination. If you could expand on some of these or introduce other ideas why the social sciences and neuroscience in collaboration together provide rich insights for other forms of naturalistic and social scientific explanations for why people believe in unseen agents and the purpose these belief systems serve in everyday human functioning.
Well, that could be another hour-long podcast in itself. I'll try to be mercifully brief. The search for a grand unified theory of religion is well underway, and in fact, the very idea of being able to explain the origin of religion, the cultural evolution of religion, the adaptive success of religion, the proper function of religion in modern societies, right? Sort of a grand unified theory of all these things that we need to explain about why and how we do religion. Even the possibility of having a grand unified theory only swam into view, as you say, in the last 20 years with so many exciting developments from the cognitive sciences, the behavioral sciences, the social sciences. There was a very simple way of looking at the argument, and that was to say that it was the cognitivists versus the adaptationists. The cognitivists thought that religion was the product of some sort of intellectual error or misapplication of ordinary intelligence. So you would get theories basically that would say, well, religion is born of ignorance, religion is born of fear, religion is born of the human mind misapplying ordinary categories like agency to things that really aren't agents, right? It's really not a Zeus throwing those lightning bolts. Only our ignorance and terror would make us resort to our hyperactive agency detector. So such is in other words, religion is essentially cognitive, and because religion is false, religion therefore must be, in some sense, an intellectual error primarily. So this is a very sketchy version of cognitivism, but nevertheless, that's sort of the popular meme of it. By contrast, the adaptationists came from the long-standing social science view of religion as an intensely complicated cultural thing that is not the result so much of ignorance and fear as very complicated cultural tools for intelligently sustaining small human groups. So it was this functionalist school that goes back deep into the social sciences, back into the, into the 19th century when the social sciences were being born, anthropology and sociology and that, which said that in order for religion to be so ubiquitous and to perform